I'm Luigi Dinales, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the director here at the Stigler Center, and today we're very happy to host John De Figueiredo for a 3-day mini course on public sector personnel economics. So first of all, thank you, John, for joining us. I want to remind everybody, especially John, that we are on record, live streaming. So please silence your phone and remember that everything you said is going to be there for eternity. And for those of you who don't know John is an extremely highly cited and established political scientist who has been on the faculty before at UCLA and MIT Sloan, and held different positions at Princeton, Harvard Law, and Stanford GSB, and now is at Duke. And John's research explores how firms use political influence, regulatory lobbying, and strategic litigation to enhance their competitive performance among others. So hopefully this is not taken as an how-to-do class, so that all the MBAs learn how to exploit this. But most recently, John is engaging in a very large project to understand basically standard selection issue in the public administration. And I think that this is something that, especially in business school, we tend to ignore, but it's an extremely important problem. The quality of our institutions depends a lot on the quality of selection and the quality of personnel that the public administration is able to select. So it is with a lot of sort of interest that I introduce you and let John describe his research. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Luigi. Thank you very much for having me. It's delighted to be here at the University of Chicago. It's been a long time since I've been here, and I'm delighted to say my daughter might show up. She's an undergraduate here. So she's a senior, so I had to get here before she left. Just thread the needle. Today what I'd like to do is I would like to talk about public sector personnel economics. So I'm going to be here for about 3 days, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about this general idea of public sector personnel economics. And what I'm going to do is today, what I'd like to do is to actually do a general motivation for why we should care about public sector. What is personnel economics? What is public sector personnel economics? And why should we care? Okay, so that's the first thing I'm going to do. And that's going to be an overarching motivation for the 3 talks. It's just kind of why you should come back. Okay, because this is an important question, and I'm going to try to motivate that a little bit. And then I'm going to spend the remaining amount of my time taking a deeper dive into the issue of elections, turnover, and ideology. So that's what the subtitle is here. So the rest of the time will be spent on thinking about how the civil servants think about turnover, when they leave, why they leave, and is that a problem? Okay, so and so what I want to do now is I want to start off with motivation for public sector personnel economics. So what is public sector personnel economics, or what is it? So if you think about the way labor economics evolved, in the 1950s, 60s, and up until the 70s, it was very, very about markets for labor. We had labor demand curve, labor supply curve. People met in the marketplace. Individuals and their skills are fungible. The jobs are fungible. We had a market clearing wage, market clearing quantity of people working, and there we had the market for labor. It turns out if you're unskilled, if you're like a temporary worker, if you're not very highly educated, this is actually not a bad description of some types of jobs. So for example, people working in the service sector, in restaurants and fast food, not a lot of training, people are somewhat interchangeable, jobs are generally temporary. If you think about yard work, or day laborers who do light construction work, people are fungible, it's an hourly job, it looks like a market. It's actually a pretty good description. And this is what we call the secondary market for labor. However, in the mid-1970s, some people, and particularly here in Chicago, noticed, hey, that only represents part of the marketplace. There's a whole other set of the marketplace where people have specialized skills, where people have education, where they actually spend a lot of time investing in all kinds of different skills and knowledge. And this knowledge may be specialized at the firm. They also notice that people don't work temporarily or part-time. In fact, what people do is they stay at a company and they work through the company. They stay at the company for a very, very long time. And what they do is they ascend, and they have careers, they have promotions. They may leave once in a while, but in fact, the primary job, the primary labor market, the job, looks a lot like what you guys are doing. It looks like MBAs, it looks like law degrees, it looks like scientists, it looks like professors, right? So when you think about the world this way, you would think that the labor economic theories we have of spot markets don't work very well in primary markets, in primary labor markets where there's high skills and lots of very specialized knowledge. In those kinds of places, we needed a new theory. And what arose was personnel economics. So, personnel economics. Personnel economics has been defined as the application of economic theory and principles to the human resources problem in the firm. So rather than thinking of labor markets between labor and firms in an open spot market, we think of a repeated gain within the firm and how people have career ladders and how people have promotions and how people stay and develop skills for their employers. So some of the topics they care about are promotions, pay, hiring, retention, teams, incentives, and performance. Okay, so these are the kinds of labor markets that occur, and the kinds of issues you might look at when you're inside the firm in the secondary market in personnel economics will be quite different than the kinds of problems you would look at in the primary market. And what you look at in the primary market might be quite different than what you look at in the secondary market. So Luigi's an example. For example, Luigi was the problem, right? So in 1992, Luigi gets his PhD. He doesn't really fit into the labor market, right? He kind of has some skills, kind of has some knowledge, right? And then when he comes to Chicago in 1992 out of MIT, and he stays. So we have to do something. We have to decide, are we going to promote him? Are we going to retain him? And now that he's been here for so long, the question is, what do we think about his performance, right? And so these are the kinds of questions that you have to ask in these primary markets. And Luigi kind of created the problem for us that Chicago had to solve by developing personnel economics. Okay. So personnel economics is thinking about how internal labor markets work, how things work inside the firm. What is public sector personnel economics? Public sector says, okay, this problem arises not only in firms, but arises in governments. And so if you're going to think about how the government works and how career ladders work and how promotion works and how wages work, then you have to think about it, what's going on in the government. And you might actually care that the government might behave differently than firms. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, how the government might behave differently than firms. And so all of this arose to create what I'm calling public sector personnel economics. Personnel economics has this great tradition here at the University of Chicago, and that's why I feel honored to be here today, because the University of Chicago is where it kind of all started. Sherwood Rosen, in the 1970s, started writing theories about personnel economics. Eddie Lazier, former professor here for a very long time, also helped to found the field with Sherwood Rosen. They're both he was at the Booth School, developed theories of personnel economics. And our own Michael Gibbs, Mike Gibbs over here, sitting right here. So I would like to say I invented the name for public sector personnel economics, and I thought I had until I found a paper by Michael written in 2009 called The Personnel Economics of the Public Sector. So I'm giving that name to you.
Do we get a royalty?
Yeah, not a very big one. So the University of Chicago is actually kind of ground zero for studying this and for thinking about these ideas. And so it's only appropriate that we bring it back to Chicago and kind of see what we've done so far. Okay, so that's what public sector personnel economics is. Now the next question that we then pose is, why should we care? Why should we care about public sector personnel economics? Okay, so if you think about how government works, there are citizens or democratic preferences or perhaps our elected representatives that have preferences. We put them into the government and out come policies. These policies can be regulations, they can be legislation, it could be a whole variety of different guidance documents. And the way the government works is preferences go in, policies come out. This is how it's mostly modeled by economists, by political scientists, and this is what happens. Well, in fact, that's actually true, but it's a vast reduction of what really happens. In fact, it goes into this black box. And what we're trying to do in this project is we're trying to open up the black box. If you think about what the government has, and what the government has to transform preferences into policies, they have two kinds of capital. They have physical capital and human capital. And it turns out the government has a lot of physical capital, but it's not really good for conversion of preferences into policies. Instead, what it is, it's the people. And so it's the civil servants, the people who work for the government, that actually transform those ideas and that legislation into regulations and policies that are on the ground. And so for that reason, we think you actually might care about what these people do. As a matter of fact, you care about a whole bunch of things about these people. You might care about whether they're motivated, whether they exert effort, whether they have any expertise in what they're doing, whether they're knowledgeable, whether they're mission-focused. That is, are they looking out for themselves or are they looking out for the country? And are they doing well in terms of their performance? So it turns out these are all the same kinds of issues personnel economics is concerned about. And so if you are concerned about how preferences turn into policies, then you care about the kind of same questions personnel economics here. In addition, there's other reasons you might care about that have nothing to do with the individuals. You actually might care at policy level. So when the government changes, when the government's a new government is elected, there's a big question about maintaining efficiency and continuity in the government. So when a government changes, you want to make sure Social Security benefits are still offered. If a disaster happens, there's someone to deal with disasters, that there's still health care offered, we still have infrastructure. So there's a whole bunch of things that happen where when the top guys leave, you still want to have the bottom guys around to be able to keep moving the government and responding to things that might happen in terms of continuity. So that's kind of on the positive sense. There's also kind of a negative sense to these things. What's negative about it? Well, if these individuals end up becoming too entrenched in the bureaucracy, they might actually use the bureaucracy for their own means and for their own preferences and their own policies and redirect resources away from what the politicians and the electorate wants into what they want. And so you might be concerned by if you entrench bureaucrats for too long, what might end up happening is they might redirect resources. So you have to be concerned about that when you're a government as well. Okay. Fran Fina and Ben Oken and Rohini Pandey in 2017 have a paper in which they describe they call it the personal economics of the state. And in that paper, they discuss differences between the public sector personnel, personal economics of the public sector, and personal economics of the private sector. And they identify 5 main differences and characteristics between the two. So the first one they identify is that the state is long-lived, that bureaucracies tend to survive regime change, whereas a lot of times in firms, when there's a regime change, we throw all the managers out. So bureaucrats survive. The second is that the set of contracts you can offer to public servants is often different than the set of contracts you can offer to private sector servants. So, for example, civil servants tend to be tenured for a variety of reasons we can talk about a little bit later. They are usually have due process in their employment claims, and pay for performance is extremely rare for a variety of different reasons. So a lot of things the private sector can do to incentivize its employees, the public sector can't. A third difference is the nature of goods exchange is different. Whereas in many things that the companies compete in, there's lots of competition. The government doesn't really compete in many of the certain areas that provide services. There's no one competing for national defense. There's no one competing for Social Security benefits. Instead, what happens is the government provides these services as monopolists, which then creates actually a self-regulation problem because they're the only ones offering it. They're also monitoring. And the government is its own ombudsman, which can create other problems as well. Finally, employee aspirations may be different. There's an emerging literature actually in economics suggesting that for the private sector, especially the young people, might be mission-oriented. That is, they care more than just about wages and profits. But it's certainly in the public sector that's been a long-term belief. People who join the public sector tend to care about social welfare, tend to care about the mission of the organization, rather than be wage-oriented. And that actually will become important when I talk about things tomorrow, when we compare public and private sector personnel and their behavior. So there's a second,
So
yes,
is this
yeah.
a description of the United States or the world?
Okay, so from this paper, it's the world.
To say that in the war they're all mission-oriented is a bit of an overstatement.
I'm not saying that they are more mission-oriented. They are more mission-oriented than they are in the private sector. Would you agree with that statement? Okay, well, you should take it up with Fina and this is their list, okay? This is their list, okay? I actually think this is a pretty good list for the United States, for the developing countries. I think this makes sense.
Luigi, you could test that by looking at, it's sort of like law and finance. If you could measure mission orientation, look at the quality institutions in different countries, that'd be pretty cool, right?
I mean, you may believe that these guys are just patronage, right? So if you think that patronage, so perhaps it's also mission orientation is negatively correlated with patronage.
It's just, what I would say for sure is that they tend to be more risk averse because they are attracted by the tangible thing.
Yes.
Yeah, so that is certainly a characteristic that is universally true in
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So ask Ben and see what he thinks. Okay. So I'm going to focus on the U.S. government. So this is now. So I'm going to stay out of Luigi's danger zone, and I'm going to be talking about the U.S. government. So why am I going to talk about the U.S. government? Well, there's 3 reasons I'm going to talk about the U.S. government over the next 3 days. Okay. The first reason is if you think about what happens in developing countries, if you think about what do the social service workers, what do the government workers look like in developing countries, they're providing very basic services at a very basic level. So they have to make sure kids are educated. So a huge part of civil service is teachers. There may be healthcare workers in Africa. The bureaucrats have very basic services they're trying to generate in Pakistan, for example. So civil servants in these countries are offering a whole set of what I call a lot of frontline services that are not so much offered in developing countries by the government, and they're not as strong, and certainly not in the United States. The nature of what we do in the United States is quite different. We have data analysts sitting in the DLS. We have scientists in the EPA, and we have a lot of contract administrators because we outsource a lot of what we do now. And so we have a lot of people who manage contracts and are project managers. So the nature of work is quite different, and I'm going to be talking more about this kind of work that's happening on the right-hand side rather than the left-hand side. That doesn't mean this doesn't happen. A lot of these services are actually devolved to the local governments. And so you could actually think about that as being an attractive place to study these kinds of workers in developed countries. A second reason I'm going to focus on the United States government is because I got a lot of data. And so this was a natural place to go. So what we've been able to do, our project team, is we've been able to acquire the personnel records for everyone who works in the federal government from 1988 to 2011. So we have 24 years of records for almost all civil servants in the United States. So we're tracking 6 million people over 24 years. And they reside in 100 different agencies. And we have about 70 variables about each person, 70 to 100 variables about each person. We know a lot about these people, and we can track them. And so in the end, we have about 28 million person-year observations. And the 28 million person-year observations are only for the non-defense department. So I'm going to be talking today about, I'm going to be leaving the Defense Department out. The civilians in the Defense Department represent about 30 to 40% of the federal government. And I'm going to leave those guys out for a bunch of security reasons. We'll talk a little bit more about them a little bit later. But I do have their data, but some of it's slightly redacted, and so we're not going to be talking about this. So what I'm going to show you today is all about non-DoD, the Department of Defense, DoD, non-DoD employees, and that's most of what I'm showing you over the next 3 days.
Does that include state as well?
Department of State. So I will have the Department of State, but I will not have the Foreign Service.
Okay.
So what I have is I have information on all employees in the federal government who are not in sensitive agencies, which you can imagine there's a lot of 3-letter agencies which are considered sensitive, and are not in sensitive occupations. So sensitive occupations, hard to describe what a sensitive occupation is. Almost everyone who carries a gun for their job is considered sensitive. So we don't have those guys. We don't have the Foreign Service. And we don't have IRS inspectors who are considered sensitive. Okay, so there's a list of occupations. But the point is, there's a lot of data. And over the next 3 days, I'll be showing you papers related to this data and derivative work from this data as well. And third, we've written a bunch of papers on this. Okay, so the papers you're going to see are going to span political science, economics. They're going to be in management. They're going to be in statistics. So they're at various stages of development. Some of them are National Bureau of Economic Research working papers. So they're various stages of development. So you're kind of catching us kind of in the middle of this project. And these are the 10 papers of which I've co-authored, but there's also another 10 or 20 papers that my students and my colleagues have authored as well, which I'll be drawing upon. So this is based upon a lot of different work in this general field of public sector personnel. So the outline of my talks. So today I'm going to talk about elections, ideology, and turnover. And if you find this somewhat interesting, you might come back. Certainly the lunch will still be free tomorrow. and I'll be talking about hiring, expertise, and promotions tomorrow, and describing how changes in the federal government and the people they hire and the way in which they promote has evolved over time from 1988 to 2011. And I'll also be comparing briefly what what we know about private sector personnel economics, the kind of the canonical facts, and whether we see those in public sector as well or not, or which ones we do and don't. Somewhat, we'll be looking at that. And then finally, on the May 9th at lunchtime, the lunch is still free. And what we'll be talking about is we're talking about race and gender gaps, wage gaps in the federal government. So we've been able to track changes in race, composition of race and wages, as well as gender and wages. And we can actually do a pretty detailed analysis of where the gaps are, why we think they're gaps, how they evolve over time. And we've also developed some synthetic data methods to make confidential data sets available to the public. And I may say a word about that. That's our statistics paper, where we actually are trying to make our data, which is confidential, available to the public and allow other people to work on it. And so I'll talk briefly about that toward the end. So that's the outline for the next 3 days. Let me stop here, because this is the final slide in the overall motivation, and then talk about elections. Is there any questions or comments? Yes?
What's the source of the data?
So the data is going to come from the Office of Personnel Management. They're like the human resources department for the government. About 4.4 million people are government employees. A lot of people in the military. Take out the post office. Post office is huge. The post office is 550,000 people work in the post office. The post office is out. The military is out. Sensitive occupations are out. We're looking at we have about somewhere in the vicinity of about 2.3 million people.
I have another question. To your point about the fact that bureaucrats survive regime changes, we see that there is movement every time there is an election and the party changes. Are we assuming that the bureaucrats just remain in the system long term?
Yeah, so that's going to be the whole point of today's paper, is the prevailing wisdom until 2017 was that the bureaucrats stayed and the political appointees left. Right, so and I'll talk a little about the structure of government, but the government has about 3,000 political appointees and 2 million people who are civil servants. The civil servants, their departure rates don't really change, but the political appointees all leave, and then we put in a whole new set of political appointees. And what I'm going to show you is that intuition is not true. It's not correct. I'm going to show you what it said. It's not correct. And if I'm able to finish today's talk, I'm going to talk about the current issue, and then I'm going to talk about conceptually what drives turnover, which is the conceptual point. And then I'm going to show you some data and statistics, and then I'm going to show you some very early results of the Trump administration, which may be of interest. This is kind of to get you not to leave early. Yes?
Are you thinking about the interplay with the private sector?
I'll show you some. So we look at the interplay. So one of the things we're going to do is, it turns out about 35% of the government doesn't work in the Washington area. They work elsewhere. And so we can actually, I never got into the verse, maybe 65% doesn't work in Washington. Anyway, a huge percentage. I forget which number it is. But the point is, a ton of people don't work in Washington. We can geolocate every employee. And then we can look at the unemployment rates in the location where they work. And so we're going to do that in this analysis. And we can see when unemployment in one location, when unemployment in California is low and unemployment in Connecticut is high, our employees more likely to leave the Connecticut office within the agency, within an occupation. So is a scientist at the EPA more likely to leave in Connecticut than they are to leave in Washington, California? We show that that is the case. So we think about the public-private sector. But it's hard to do wage comparisons. I have a student who's working on that at UCLA actually right now. God bless him. It's a hard problem. Okay, here there's a big smiley guy, okay? This is a lot of hair, a lot of nice hair. This is our president. This is when he was still president-elect in 2016. He was running in the primary, and the business council, the government council of unions, a survey was done of federal employees, and the federal employees, they asked, while he was in the primary, they asked the following question: if Donald Trump is elected president, would you consider leaving federal service? Okay, and this was about March, and 2/3 said no, but 1/3 said, yeah, I think about it, right? Which is a pretty large number. It'd be like if we surveyed all the faculty here, and we said, if the president of the university changes, would you think about leaving? And imagine about 1/3 of the Chicago faculty said, oh yeah, I think about it seriously. Right?
No, if he changes, if somebody particularly is appointed president.
Yeah.
I can't think of a lot of people.
Right. So yeah, so there's a lot of people you might actually leave. Okay, so this is a survey. So this was done. And then what happened in March and after President Trump was elected in 2017, a lot of people started coming out of the woodwork saying they were leaving the government. And they were very highly publicized cases, extremely highly publicized cases. This is Michael Cox. He's a very high-level scientist at the EPA, and he said, I've been here 25 years, I'm a high-level scientist. I and many of my staff believe that your administration is acting contrary to what the majority of people want and who they pay our salaries. We're supposed to ensure clean air, we're supposed to ensure clean water, and make sure that the air we breathe is safe, and I don't think you're doing that. And so therefore I'm leaving. It was a big public letter protest, received lots and lots of information, lots of press in the newspapers. And so this suggests that there's something about what civil servants do, which is not just completely making the sausage, right? They actually care about the policy outcomes and who's running the country. In fact, you can actually look across in the 2017 EPA officials. These are headlines like CSI, ripped from the headlines, right? EPA officials disheartened by agency direction are leaving in drones. You have the State Department entire senior staff resign. As a matter of fact, this was quite surprising for most pundits, because the people who resigned were not people who were in charge of policy. They were in charge of administration. It was the head of the assistant secretary for administration, the person who makes sure the paychecks get paid. It was the person who was head of security, just make sure the buildings are secure. There was a whole bunch of people who were in administrative positions rather than policy positions that then resigned across the board. And Trump's own Interior Secretary, Ryan Zinke, who is no longer Interior Secretary, goes to war against his own departments, suggesting everyone in this department is disloyal and unpatriotic. Okay? So you have this going on where civil servants were being both attacked, were unhappy, and they started exiting. This received a lot of press. I will tell you, all this happened about a couple months after we wrote this paper. So this is now some of the things in the paper may seem obvious, but in December 2016, they weren't so obvious. On the other hand, not everybody is unhappy. Some people are absolutely delighted. The National Border Patrol Council, which is the union which represents the Border Patrol, they actually noted, this was in March of 2016, that they have a long-standing practice of not endorsing presidential candidates in primaries. They've stated that. However, this time we're going to make an exception. And what they do is they endorse Trump. They endorse Trump in the Republican primary because they think he's just he'll be a fabulous president, and they make their first endorsement. Later on, they noted that after he passed his 3 executive orders regarding immigration, they thought this was absolutely fabulous. We applaud the 3 executive orders. We're confident it's going to make people safe. Morale has never been higher. So in different parts of the government, there's different reactions to the president and the president's policies. And these are all civil servants. Again, think about it. They basically have tenure. They don't have to leave. They just have to get the job done.
Okay.
So the underlying idea of this talk is that politics could cause turnover. And this is what we're going to be studying, the idea of how politics can result in turnover in the civil service. There's another branch to this, which is turnover affects performance. So I'm not going to actually deal with this in this talk, but there is a literature that argues that the more people you have turning over in an organization, and even in the government, the lower performance you have. I'll just give you one example of this latter part, and then I'll leave it aside, and we can talk about it during discussion time. Is my co-author, David Lewis, looks at how many political people you put inside an agency, how many political appointees you put inside an agency. So on this axis is the percent of managers in the agency that are appointed by politicians. And on the vertical axis is a measure of the efficiency of the agency. And these are considered like business metrics for business school students. Do you have a strategic plan? Does the strategic plan outline your goals? Do you have a method to achieve your strategic plan? These kinds of very simple business process kinds of things every organization should have. And what they find in their paper is that the more political appointees you have, the less efficiency is run the agency. They also find, I'll come back in a second, they also find that the longer people serve, the more efficient the organization becomes. Right? It's concave, the curve is concave, but these kinds of things together suggest the longer the agency is, you have someone's head, then what happens with decreasing marginal returns, you actually get more efficient organization. And I'll be happy to talk much more about this, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I just wanted to try to say there has been work suggesting that turnover can be a bad thing, especially at the senior levels of the government.
Yeah, here you mentioned the efficiency of these different government branches. On that score of 0 to 100, where do private sector companies compare? Like, is it significantly higher in terms of their efficiency in comparison?
So this was developed by the government in order by the second Bush administration in order to rate agencies as to whether they were doing basic business things. They didn't actually measure it against business. They basically asked business people to put together a scorecard of business processes that would make sense. And so they didn't.
So it's like the efficiency of the government agencies against each other, not
against each other,
versus
exactly.
how well they would do
Right.
compared to a.
Assumedly, most businesses are like in the 90 to 100 range.
Okay.
I would hope.
I would hope so too.
Okay. So what drives turnover in the government? So let's talk about what drives turnover in the government. So what might drive civil servants to leave? So I'm going to try to identify three kind of main factors that drive civil servants to leave. Before I talk about this, let me just tell you, there's a whole bunch of literature on this. I've classified the literature into 5 main categories that people have identified. The first is public and private wage comparisons. This someone asked about, does the private sector matter? And the answer is yes. There's a huge literature on that. Secondly, job satisfaction. I'm happy with my job. I'm unhappy with my job. Third is public sector motivation. That is, I'm motivated by public service. Fourth is leadership. I don't like my boss. And fifth is demographics. What's changing in the demographic mix of the employees? Yeah.
For the purposes of this talk, is turnover going to be defined as the employee initiating the separation, or does it include separations that are initiated by the government as well?
Okay, so we're going to look at, are you at the firm, are you at the government in the next period? Okay, so we're going to say you departed for that. So we have data on resignations. The government would not give us data on anything that wasn't resignation. So we don't know were you forced out or let me say it this way. If there are reasons you left which were considered positive, the government gave us the data. If there are reasons you left that were considered negative, the government did not give us the data. So we know you left, and they don't tell us the reason why. Okay. There are some things like we know if you die. We know if you die on the job or if you die at home. So there's some things that we do know. That's a nice exogenous event, which we can actually use for an instrument. But this is these are separations. But again, remember, it's very, very hard for the government. It's like getting rid of a professor. They have tenure, right?
These are all tenured civil servants.
Effectively, they're all tenured. After 2 years, you're effectively tenured in civil service. It's very, very hard to get rid of a civil servant. Yes.
What about patronage and career sort of aspiration? If I am with a winning party, I expect to do a fast career, but then at the top, there'll be someone from the opposite party I know is going to retaliate against me or it's not part of, and so I leave for that reason. Okay, that's what I'm going to show. We're going to show some of this. The literature actually has, what's missing in this literature of public administration is the idea of politics affecting career paths is largely missing. Okay, so this is what you're saying. It's in Italian.
And then Italian. You're missing the largest explanatory variable. So politics for departures is largely missing. So we're going to basically look at 3 main effects we want to look at. The first is elections. The first effect is that we believe that elections will cause people to depart. As elections cause people to depart for a couple of reasons. The first reason it causes people to depart is because when there's a big transition in the government, especially when parties change, it's a natural time for people to leave. Anytime there's a transition in an organization, people begin to re-examine what they're doing. This is true in the public sector and the private sector. When there are big transitions in organizations, people begin to examine their futures and figure out what else they might want to do. In addition, what ends up happening with elections is the new president brings people in, especially at the senior levels, and those people who were at the senior levels begin to get marginalized. Because I want my people, the people I trust, the people that I know, to come in and start running things. And so even though you could stay, you choose to leave because you're end up being marginalized. And so elections is a big time when people end up leaving. That's the first step. The second I want to talk about is ideological separation. Okay, so this is not in the literature, and this is, I think, one of the big contributions to our paper. So imagine you have an ideology, and I'm going to make this super simple. We have a mathematical model in the paper, but imagine you have an ideology, and the policies that people can have preferences which are left, center, or right. Okay, so now let's put down two bureaucrats. There's a bureaucrat over here, bureaucrat B, who's to the left, and bureaucrat C, who's to the right. And now put down a president. So the left's president makes policies close to his ideal points in the left. Bureaucrat B thinks this is great. These things are not too far apart. But bureaucrat C is unhappy about this because the policies that the president is putting down in the policy space is very far away from their preferences. If the bureaucrat cares about the distance of the policies to their preferences, then these people end up getting unhappy and they end up departing. Moreover, it could be worse if what they care about is not just the policy outcome, but actually making what they perceive as bad policy. So here you can imagine we have a left president that wants to allow undocumented workers into the United States and let them work for a little while. And you're a bureaucrat C who believes in border security and we shouldn't let people in who don't have the correct documentation. So it's bad enough that this is happening, but you're even more unhappy because you're facilitating that policy. In essence, you're making the bad sausage. So the utility function could be composed of two different components, the policy outcome as well as the dirty hands that you're engaged in. Okay, so these kinds of effects are going to cause bureaucrat C to depart and bureaucrat B to stay. You could then have a switch in presidents and bring a right president, and the exact opposite thing starts happening. Bureaucrat B is unhappy for those same reasons, and bureaucrat C is very happy, stays, bureaucrat B wants to leave. There's also theoretical refinements you can make if you do a multi-stage model and you do kind of slightly more complex models. In our paper, what we show is that under some circumstances, a bureaucrat A will stay, even though there's a right president. And the reason is because the bureaucrat A is such a liberal, they actually hope that in the next stage, a liberal will be elected. And so we call this wait them out. And what we do is we sit here and we wait, we just hope that the next president will be liberal. And if our preferences are strong enough, then we will actually wait them out. We'll try to wait out this president and hope that the next president is liberal. Then we get tons and tons of great policy that we love. So these are the kinds of things you can do with this model. We're going to test this main effect, which is we're going to look at the ideological distance between the bureaucrat, or we're going to call it the agency, and president. And as this separation grows, and there's a change in presidents from liberal to conservative, you should see people leaving and under some very special pattern. And I'll show you that in a minute. Yes?
Is there any way to segment these bureaucrats into people in the civil service that are just doing back office functions, say secretaries, versus people actually carrying out policies?
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll show you how we do that. The last thing I want to highlight is, and I'll go into more about what the government looks like in the next talk. I didn't want to go into depth here. But the government, like any organization, is a hierarchy. At the top, we have cabinet and sub-cabinet officials, secretary, assistant secretary, director of the FDA. These are all cabinet and sub-cabinet officials. There's about 1,000 of those, 1,200 of those people. Then what we call senior executive service. So these are like the generals in the Army. These are the very top of the civil service. They tend to be mostly civil service. They're, for example, the director of counterintelligence for Homeland Security is a senior executive service. The director for administration, including the administration of the EPA, is a senior executive service. These are people, the director, I think, of disaster relief for FEMA is civil service. So these are very high-level people, have tons of responsibility, tons of expertise. These are the people who actually make the policy. So these are the people who actually are very, very close to making policy. Below them, we have GS 13 and 15 equivalents. These are kind of the high bands. These are like the senior professionals, the scientists, the lawyers, the managers, very senior people in the government. Then what we have is we have a bunch of kind of low-level managers, which we'll call supervisors. These are people who manage 6 or 7 people. And then we have workers. Okay? And there are about 2.3 million civil servants if you take out the post office. These are all rough numbers. About 2.3 million civil servants if you take out the post office. And these are the civil servants, and those are the political appointees. They intermingle at the SES level. So there's some SES, and in fact, some of the political appointees might even go down to the GS level. If you worked on a campaign, we got to find you a job. We can't say that you're assistant secretary or something until we put you you're 23 years old. We make you some legal advisor to somebody, and you provide support function, and then you're down here somewhere. But what you see is that most of the people are civil servants in the government. Yes.
To what extent do you think election-triggered resignations might be triggered by a perception that the reigning president-elect is especially incompetent rather than ideology opposed?
It's hard. There's too few elections to separate out incompetent presidents and ideological presidents. That'd be hard to do. Okay, so these guys all leave. And when an election happens, the political appointees all take off. 95% of them resign, and basically 100% of them, almost 100% of them go. These guys all are supposed to all stay because they have tenure, right? So these guys, that's the main view. Right. So now let me. I'm going to go a little bit faster. I'm going to show some data. Can I hold your question or?
Just about the political appointees, do they have to leave or do they choose to leave?
They can leave, or they can offer to resign on January 20th, or they can be fired. So pretty much everyone offers a resignation. Everyone offers a resignation, and then the president keeps it for continuity of government. Okay, so let's talk about the data. So as I mentioned before, we have the Central Personnel Data File for the Office of Personnel Management from 1988 to 2011. We also are going to show you some Clinton-Lewis scores. In order to get this idea, in order to get the idea of whether a person is a liberal or conservative, when that bureaucrat's B or C, what we do is we look at agency ideology. So it turns out we know from work that's been done before which agencies have a liberal bent and which agencies have a conservative bent. And so we can tell which agencies are likely to have the most people resigning. And the Clinton-Lewis scores allow us to do that. And finally, and I haven't talked about this in the talks, I didn't have enough time, but we're also going to examine the State of the Union address to examine where the president is emphasizing the policies. So where is the president really focusing their policies? And you might care if you're high level, you want to be in an area of focus rather than an area of being ignored by the president. So we're going to look at the State of the Union addresses. Let me talk about the Clinton-Lewis scores. David Lewis and Josh Clinton of Vanderbilt have scored every agency based on their ideology. I won't be happy to talk during question time as to how they did this. What I'm going to do is this is the scoring on a -1 to +1. You can't read this, so I'm going to put on my glasses. And I'm going to show you the most liberal agencies. Okay, this is to give you a flavor of what it looks like. So ACTION doesn't exist anymore. The African Development Foundation, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Peace Corps, Occupational Safety and Health Committee, Commission on Civil Rights, Equal Opportunity Commission, Employment Commission, Labor and Housing and Urban Development. If I kind of list those things, I said, do you think those are liberal or conservative? You probably say those sound on the liberal side, right? So it seems to have on the conservative side, Defense, Navy, Army, Air Force, okay. And the National Drug Council, National Security Council, Department of Commerce, people that support business, and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and Export Import Bank. These seem to be pretty well aligned to defense and business, right? Okay. And then who are the moderate agencies? Again, I'm just taking snapshots. The Federal Trade Commission, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the National Credit Union Administration, the NASA. If you kind of think of these guys, you wouldn't say, oh yeah, these guys are liberal-leaning or conservative-leaning. You'd say, yeah, these are, I don't really know, right? So the first approximation, this seems correct. Okay, so we're going to use this, and we're going to compare whether they're a liberal agency, and we're going to compare them to the president. If the agency is liberal, the president is liberal, we're going to either the line, and if there is an ideological mismatch, and the president is liberal, and the people are coming out of conservative agencies. Okay, so that's the, and vice versa, and vice versa. Okay, so we're going to do regressions on 4 sets of populations, and this comes up to the question we asked earlier. We're going to do it on the career senior executive service, and we're going to be most concerned about these guys, because these are guys who make policy. The GS 13 and 15, which is the next level below, we're going to have separate regressions for supervisors and separate regressions for everyone else. And these are the people who are just kind of these, if you're working down here, you're just literally pushing the paper. It's an in-box, out-box exercise, right? You're not making policy. It's that you're making sure the trains are moving, and you're very far away from policy. The SES, they're actually doing it. They're actually making the policies with the politicians. Okay. I'm going to put my glasses on in a second. I just want you to know that the way to read these regressions is this is the least, these are the lowest level guys, and these are the highest level guys. Okay, so that's one thing. Lots of observations, tons of fixed effects. So we're at somewhere between 17 million and 100,000, 200,000 observations in these regressions. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to blow that one up, and I'm going to show this one to you. Okay, so year 1 is a variable, and I'm going to show you some pictures after this to give you an idea of the magnitude of these effects. But year 1 is the year after the election. What do departure rates look like the year after the election? And what you see is that the departure rates go up 1.6 percentage points for the SES. 1.6 percentage points. Okay, so this doesn't sound like a lot, 1.6 percentage points, but in fact, given a base rate of about 8% departure rate, it's a big change, right? It's a good amount of change. And I'll quantify all this in 2 slides. I'll quantify exactly how much it is. Notice that as you move down lower and lower in the organization, the effects are really small in departure rates. Lots of people don't leave when you're lower down the organization. It's the senior guys who leave. The junior guys don't. Unemployment. Remember I told you that we geolocate every employee and then we measure the unemployment rate in that location. As the unemployment rate rises for everybody except for these guys, which this is almost 0, people are less likely to leave. So this is a 1 percentage point increase in causing a 0.2% percentage point decrease in departure rates. And this is the ideological mismatch variable. What it says is that if you have a liberal agency and a conservative president, the people in the liberal agency who are SES have a 0.5 percentage point increased probability of leaving. And notice that this drops, for some reason in the big people, for the Model 1 it's actually kind of large, but this is the ideological mismatch seems to matter. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this ideological mismatch variable and I'm going to show you what it looks like by year. So that's the average over all 8 years in the whole data set. But what we see here is this is the year in the presidential term, year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this is the year of the presidential term. Some presidents, like the first Bush, only gets 4 years. But so this is year of the presidential term. 0 is the estimated effect, and then is the line here. Anything above the line means people are more likely to leave ideologically mismatched agencies relative to ideologically matched agencies. That is someone sitting in a conservative agency more likely to leave than someone who's sitting in a liberal agency when the president is liberal? That's what we want to know, and vice versa. And what we see is that in the first 3 years of the presidency, the black line is SES, is the top guys. And the first 3 years, that's when people leave. The people are more likely to leave. So you have a bunch of effects going on here. You have an election effect, and you have an ideology effect, and it compounding the election effect that causes people to leave in the civil service. And then these people get replaced, and that's why we think this thing goes negative, because all the SES guys have been replaced, and now we don't need to replace them anymore because they've all been replaced. Let me show you what the effects look like. The base rate of departure across the government for SES is 19 over 3 years. We have 19%, 75% of the SES will be over a 3-year period. The election effect is about a 0.07 elasticity, additional 1.41%, depending on which model you use. The mismatch effect over 3 years is equivalent to 2.82 or 0.14 elasticity. This is the low priority. This is being the president doesn't care about you from the State of the Union. And the total effect is about 25.85. So you get a 6 percentage point bump in departures for political reasons that the literature doesn't identify to date. And it represents about elasticity of 0.31 over 3 years. So you get a 31% increase in departure rates over this time period. Let me finish up and then I'll take questions if I can. I want to say a word about, so this is kind of the political effect of being in the public sector and departure rates. Let me take this last thing and show you 2 slides of the Trump administration and close. So we wrote this paper in 2016, and then Trump came in, and everyone wanted to, all this press came out, everyone wanted to know what's happening with Trump. Everyone was saying. So we FOIA'd the OPM, and they will no longer give us the data. Okay. So we asked Freedom of Information Act, they will no longer give us the data. So they give us different data. And so it's really hard to analyze this data. We just got it about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we've begun to look at this. Let me just show you, again, the problem is we cannot compare our current data they gave us to the old data. So it's not comparable. We can compare within. So what we did was we FOIA'd 1 year before Trump and 1 year after Trump. And we said, maybe we can compare 1 year before Trump was elected to 1 year after Trump was elected and see what's happening. So these top 2 agencies are those 2 liberal agencies. We'll consider Trump as being conservative for a moment, okay? So consider him as conservative, okay? And these are the 2 liberal agencies. This is the departure rates of all employees, not just SES, because we don't know who's SES anymore. They won't give us that. Of all employees in the year before Trump was elected. And these are the departure rates in the year after Trump was elected. And what you see is that in the 2 liberal agencies, departures rose. 10% in the Department of Labor, but 43% in the EPA. There's been a very large increase in departure rates in the second year after Trump was elected. These are the conservative agencies that I mentioned: ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Patrol. These guys are on the border, and Export-Import Bank. These are the departure rates in the year before Trump was elected. These are in percentage points. These are the departure rates after Trump was elected, and this is the percentage change. Huge numbers of these people are staying than did under the Obama administration. So this seems to lend some credibility to the idea that agencies which are aligned with the president have much lower civil service departure rates than agencies who are not aligned with the president. Last figure I'll show you is my co-author has David Lewis with Kathleen Doherty and Scott Limbacher have just completed a paper looking at, what they did was they actually did a survey of the SES, and they got a bunch of data from it. And then they started matching against LinkedIn and the Federal Yellow Book to see who was leaving, across agencies. And so the dark line, and so they did this a month-by-month analysis. They're tracking these people month by month in the SES. And this is the liberal agencies, the solid line. And these are people, the dashed line, are people in conservative agencies. And what you see is that there's really no difference in departure rates between liberal and conservative agencies in the SES from 2015 to 2016. And then what happens Trump is elected here in November, departure rates for both go up right around the election time, which isn't surprising. And then what happens is, right around here, you can see there's a separation. And what ends up happening is people are departing the liberal agencies at a much higher rate than they're departing the conservative agencies. So this kind of is congruent with the previous data that I showed you that we got from the OPM, which is slightly messier data. So the answer is, it looks like this ideology effect is happening under Trump. Is it bigger than it was before with previous presidents? We don't know, because our data is not comparable, unfortunately. If we get comparable data, we'll be able to check. So in the end, I think what's important here is to recognize that the federal government, so public sector personnel economics is an important topic, I think. How the sausage is made, making sure we get competent policies is just very important. The way that's made is through human capital. And in general, I think that what we want is a competent federal civil service. It needs to be responsive to the electorate, and it needs to be responsive to the electorate because if the electorate changes, you want policies to be able to change. But changing policies which are not based on expertise is probably a bad idea. So you actually do care about both inputs from the politicians and inputs from the civil service. The combination of expertise and preference and democratic preferences together, I think, is what creates good policy. And keeping civil servants and thinking about departures as political tools versus for political reasons as opposed to other reasons is an important topic. I think that's worth further investigation. Thank you very much. So, question? So it's a question at the back.
Yeah, this is very interesting, but I wonder if you can touch on, it's clear based on your research that there is turnover based on political ideology and who's the president. I'm wondering if you could touch on kind of the so what of this analysis, i.e. what are the policy ramifications of this turnover as people leave with different presidential regimes? How does that influence the policy that's enacted under these regimes and under the new people that are coming in to replace those that are turning over based on the presidential changes?
Yeah, so as I said in the earlier slide, so there's a literature on thinking about turnover and policies, right? So there's two or three different things I think you care about in terms of policies. You care what the substance of the policy. You care is a policy based in fact. You care about policy implementation. Right? So what's happening is when you lose this expertise, so people don't look at the substance of the policy. So there are political scientists who look at the substance of the policy. I'm not looking at substance of policy and how it's related to people coming in. As a matter of fact, the reason we have regime change, presidential change, is because we do want to have changes in policy. Generally, that's why we have it. So people are less looking at the substance of the policy is one issue, which you can get a big debate about. What you do care about is it being implemented efficiently? And those are some of the part scores that Dave Lewis was talking about. You know, do we get efficient execution of the policies? And then you care a little bit about, is the policy based in fact? And when you lose a lot of civil servants, senior civil servants at the senior executive level, you lose a lot of that expertise. So it seems that what's going on is you lose those latter two. The first two actually something you might want because of regime change, but the latter two seem to be diminished. So you get what we would call lower quality policy.
Does that leave an opportunity in your data to evaluate who replaces the bureaucrats that are turned over when people leave office?
Yes. So I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. I'll talk a little bit about who's replacing, who's getting promoted. I'll talk about who's getting promoted. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that. That's a good question. Someone else? Yes.
Is there any reason to think that the supervisors and the low-level employees, is there any reason to think that the political affiliations of the supervisors and the low-level employees is not necessarily correlated with which department they're in?
So there's reasons to believe that and reasons not to believe that. And the reasons, the way to test this. So there are a number of papers that show that if you want to go work at the EPA, even as a low-level person, you probably want to save the environment. Right? That's kind of what happens. And if you really want to kind of make sure the country is secure, you go work at the Department of Defense. Right? So even at the lowest level, there's a literature which shows that people tend to move to the agencies, which is supposed to be related to their ideology. Which means it's very, very hard to switch an agency's ideology because its component parts are composed of that ideology. Right? So that's the first thing. You could believe that people come in because they think, oh, the environment we need more development, so I'm going to go to the EPA and solve this problem. And I'm going to make sure environmental regulation is compatible with economic development. Perfectly acceptable theory. The evidence doesn't line up with it as much. There is a way to get at this that people started doing. It's not so much for young people, but it's more for slightly older people. We're looking at campaign contributions of employees. So it turns out if you give a donation of more than $200 or $250 to a political campaign, you have to disclose it. With now the advanced computing and lots of good algorithms, we can now match employee names in the government to contributions, and now we can create contributions. You look at your contributions into which candidates you're giving it to develop a very fine-grained ideology measure of what that agency looks like. So that's what's being done now in political science. And it's a big effort, right? Because there's 1 million contributions given every year, and there's 2.5 million employees. So it's a big effort. But when you can do this, then you can score every agency based on its constituents parts, and we know where everybody is. So we can see whether the people at the EPA in California are more liberal than the EPA in Ohio, more liberal than the EPA in Washington. So you could imagine there's lots of things you could do if you could actually pull this off. So that's a good question, but it's a hard effort. God bless them as well. Yes.
Looking at the scores of the different administrations, sort of touching upon what you just talked about, then might this have some positive effect in the centering on many of the different agencies? So, as the American electorate is not entirely far to the left or far to the right or anything, but some of the agencies are. So when you have a president who drives up more turnover and then replaces, I would assume that the people who move in to take the empty positions align more politically with the president, and therefore against what the agency was before. Do we then see that there's a centering effect on these agencies when you have a president who disagrees with them come to office?
Yeah, so you need to think about both the entry mechanism and the exit mechanism, right? So imagine that it's the EPA, and maybe it's a liberal agency, and then what you have is you have a conservative president comes in, a bunch of liberals leave that work in the agency, and are replaced by conservatives, so it moves the agency to the center. Okay, so that's your model. The people coming, the liberals are leaving and the conservatives are coming in. And if that happens for a long time, you can probably move the agency. But if then what happens, a liberal agency, the liberal is elected, then what will happen is those conservatives leave and just move it back. So you have to have some kind of model of what you think is going on with an entry and exit and how it happens over time. And that's what we do have a model of that in this quitting and protest paper I mentioned, in which the question is, are you willing to wait? How patient are you? And are you willing to wait in the hope that a better president comes along? So I think these are really good questions. I think our quitting and protest paper gets at this from a theoretical state. Good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, guys.